The wind howled across the empty plains like a wounded animal. Snow blew sideways through the crooked wooden fence surrounding the tiny cabin. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth struggled to stay alive, its faint orange glow barely warming the single-room home. Mary Whitaker pulled her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders. Winter had come early that year, too early. The crops had failed. The chickens had stopped laying, and the small sack of flour sitting on the shelf above the stove was nearly empty. Mary stared into the fire, her tired eyes reflecting the flickering flames. Just one more week, she whispered to herself. If the weather cleared, she could walk the 12 miles into town and try to find work again. Maybe washing clothes, maybe cooking for the hotel. Anything. Her stomach growled softly. She ignored it. Across the room, her little daughter Lucy slept beneath a patchwork blanket Mary had sewn from old flour sacks. The girl's tiny chest rose and fell peacefully, unaware of how close they were to losing everything. Mary smiled faintly at the sight of her. Lucy was the only reason she kept fighting. Without her, Mary wasn't sure she would have had the strength. The wind slammed against the cabin walls again. Crack! The door rattled violently in its frame. Mary stood and checked the wooden latch. The storm was getting worse. Snow was piling high against the outside wall now. If the roof didn't hold, they'd freeze before morning. She turned back toward the fire knock. Mary froze. Her heart skipped. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. No one came this far out in the middle of winter. Knock. This time it was louder. Someone was at the door. Mary's pulse raced. She slowly reached for the iron poker beside the fireplace. Her husband had died 2 years earlier in a mining accident, leaving her alone out here on the edge of nowhere. Since then, she had learned a harsh truth about the frontier. Not every stranger meant well. Another knock. This one weaker, almost desperate. Please. The voice was barely audible through the storm. Mary hesitated. Her mind raced through every warning she had ever heard. Bandits pretending to be travelers, drifters robbing lonely farms, men who knocked politely, then forced their way in. Lucy stirred in her sleep. Mary looked at her daughter. If someone out there truly needed help, turning them away in this storm could mean death. Mary slowly approached the door. Who's there? She called out. The wind swallowed her voice. Then came the answer. A traveler. Ma'am, the voice sounded rough, exhausted. I just need shelter for the night. Mary tightened her grip on the poker. What kind of traveler? There was a long pause. Then the man answered quietly. A tired one. Mary hesitated again. Snow hammered the cabin roof. If she left him outside, the storm would kill him. And despite everything life had taken from her, Mary Whitaker had never been the kind of person who turned someone away in need. Slowly, she lifted the latch. The door creaked open. A blast of freezing wind rushed inside, and there he stood. A tall man leaned heavily against the doorframe, snow covering his wide-brimmed hat and shoulders. His coat was worn and dusted, white. His boots were thick with mud and ice, but what caught Mary's attention immediately were his eyes. Sharp, alert, not the eyes of a helpless drifter. Those were the eyes of someone who had seen a lot of life. The man removed his hat respectfully. Evening, ma'am. His voice was calm, but strained with exhaustion. Mary studied him carefully. He didn't look dangerous, but appearances could lie. What do you want? She asked. Just warmth. He gestured weakly toward the fire and a corner of the floor. Mary noticed something then. The man's left arm hung stiffly at his side. Blood had soaked through the sleeve. He was injured. Badly. You've been shot, Mary said. The stranger glanced at his arm. Just grazed, he muttered, but the blood dripping onto the snow said otherwise. Mary sighed. Come inside before you freeze. The man stepped in. Carefully, snow melted from his coat onto the wooden floor as he shut the door behind him. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at the fire like a man who hadn't seen warmth in days. Mary noticed the way he carried himself. Even injured, he stood tall, confident, like someone used to being in control. She handed him a chair. "Sit." He obeyed. Slowly, the man winced as he removed his coat, revealing a deep tear in the sleeve, where the bullet had scraped across his upper arm. Mary fetched a cloth and a small bottle of homemade alcohol from the shelf. "This will sting," she warned. "I've had worse." She cleaned the wound carefully. The man didn't flinch once. Lucy stirred again in the corner. The stranger glanced toward the small sleeping figure. "Your daughter?" Mary nodded. "Lucy," he smiled softly. "She looks peaceful." Mary finished bandaging his arm. "Storm caught you on the road." The stranger leaned back in the chair. "Something like that." Mary studied him again. There was something strange about him despite his worn clothes. There was a quiet confidence in his voice, a calmness. Like he wasn't worried about anything, not even the storm. "What's your name?" Mary asked. The man hesitated for just a moment. Then he answered. "Daniel." Mary nodded. "Well, Daniel, supper isn't much tonight." She reached for the nearly empty flour sack. "But you're welcome to share it." Daniel watched as she mixed water with the last of the flour, making thin flatbread over the fire. "You're giving your food to a stranger," he said quietly. Mary shrugged. "If someone knocked on your door hungry, what would you do?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked around the small cabin, the cracked walls, the patched blankets, the nearly empty shelves. He realized something. This woman had almost nothing, yet she had opened her door without hesitation. Finally he spoke. "I think I do the same." Mary handed him a plate. "Eat." Daniel took the bread. For a moment he just stared at it. Then he said something unexpected. "You shouldn't trust people so easily." Mary smiled faintly. "Maybe." She sat across from him. "But sometimes kindness is all a person has left." Daniel studied her face in the firelight. There was strength there, a quiet determination, the kind that came from surviving hardship most people couldn't imagine. He took a bite of the bread. It was simple, plain, but somehow it tasted better than any meal he'd had in weeks. Outside, the storm raged harder. Inside, the small cabin felt warmer for the first time in days. Daniel allowed himself to relax, but Mary didn't notice the way his eyes occasionally drifted to the window, watching, waiting, because the truth was, Daniel wasn't just a traveler, and he wasn't just injured. Somewhere out in that storm, men were searching for him. Men who believed they had just robbed one of the richest cattle owners in the territory. But what they didn't know was that the man sitting quietly in Mary Whitaker's cabin, eating her last piece of bread, was the very millionaire cowboy they were hunting. And by morning, everything in Mary's life was about to change. The storm raged through the night. Wind battered the tiny cabin like a furious beast trying to tear it apart. Snow piled against the walls, burying the lower half of the door. Inside, the fire crackled softly. Mary had laid an old blanket near the hearth for Daniel to sleep on. It wasn't much, but it was warmer than the freezing ground outside. Lucy still slept peacefully in the corner. Daniel, however, wasn't sleeping. He sat quietly beside the fire, staring into the flames. His injured arm throbbed under the bandage Mary had wrapped around it. The wound wasn't life-threatening, but it reminded him of just how close things had come earlier that evening. Too close. He leaned back slightly and closed his eyes, remembering just 12 hours earlier. The sun had been setting when Daniel Carter rode along the narrow canyon trail leading back to his ranch. That the ride had been peaceful, quiet, just the rhythmic sound of his horses' hooves against the frozen dirt. Then the gunshot shattered the silence. Bang! His horse reared. Another shot cracked through the canyon. Daniel instantly knew what was happening. Ambush. 3 masked riders burst from behind the rocks. blocking the trail ahead. Bandits. Evening, Mr. Carter, one of them shouted. Daniel's eyes narrowed. They knew his name. That meant this wasn't random. They had planned it. The leader pointed his rifle directly at him. Word travels fast in these parts, the man said with a grin behind the mask. Richest cattle rancher in the territory, riding alone, with a saddlebag full of payroll money. Daniel slowly raised his hands. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't stupid either. 3 rifles aimed at him meant one thing: wait for the right moment. Now, the bandit continued. You can make this easy, or you can make it painful. Daniel remained calm. Take the money, he said, and the bandit tilted his head and ride away. The men laughed. One of them dismounted and grabbed the saddlebag. Inside was nearly $10,000 meant for the ranch workers. The man whistled. Well, I'll be. But then something happened they didn't expect. Daniel moved fast. He kicked his horse forward and grabbed the nearest rider by the collar, slamming him off the saddle. The canyon erupted into chaos. Bang! A bullet tore through Daniel's coat, grazing his arm. His horse bolted forward as he knocked the bandit unconscious, the other to fire again. But the horse was already sprinting through the narrow canyon. Daniel didn't look back. He rode hard for miles, but the storm had rolled in faster than expected. Snow began falling. Then the trail disappeared. By nightfall, Daniel had no choice but to abandon the horse and search for shelter. That's when he saw the faint glow of a lantern in the distance. Mary's cabin. The fire popped softly. Daniel opened his eyes. Again, Mary sat nearby, mending one of Lucy's worn dresses. You should sleep, she said gently. Without looking up, Daniel shook his head. Storm like this, someone should stay awake. Mary smiled faintly. You're not used to trusting strangers either, are you? Daniel chuckled. Something like that. Mary studied him for a moment. There was something different about him, even the way he spoke. Polite, calm, educated, not like the rough cowhands or drifters she usually saw in town. You don't seem like a drifter, she said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. What makes you say that? Mary pointed toward his boots. They're expensive. Daniel glanced down, even covered in mud. They were clearly well-made leather. Mary continued. And your hands? He looked at them. Strong, scarred, but not the hands of a man who had spent his life begging or drifting. You work, Mary said. Hard work. Daniel smiled slightly. You notice a lot when you live alone out here, she replied. You learn to. Silence filled the cabin again. Then Lucy suddenly stirred. Her eyes blinked open. She looked around sleepily before noticing the stranger. For a moment she stared. Then she whispered softly, Mama. Who's that? Mary stood and walked over. That's Daniel, she said gently. He's staying with us tonight because of the storm. Lucy studied him carefully. Then she smiled. Hello, Daniel. Daniel smiled back. Hello, Lucy. The little girl yawned and rubbed her eyes. Are you a cowboy? Daniel chuckled. Something like that. Lucy's eyes sparkled with excitement. My daddy was a cowboy too. Mary's sewing needle paused. For a moment sadness flickered across her face. Lucy continued innocently. He used to say, cowboys were the bravest men in the world. Daniel glanced at Mary. She forced a small smile. Lucy curled back under the blanket and soon drifted back to sleep. Daniel spoke quietly. Your husband? Mary nodded. Mining accident. I'm sorry. It was a long time ago. But Daniel could tell the pain never truly left. He leaned back in his chair again. You're strong, he said. Mary laughed softly. No, yes. He looked around the cabin again. You're raising a child alone, surviving out here, sharing your last food with a stranger. Mary shrugged. What choice do I have? Daniel didn't answer, but in that moment, Something shifted inside him. He had spent years building one of the largest ranches in the territory. Thousands of cattle, hundreds of workers, more money than he could spend in 10 lifetimes. But somehow, this small cabin felt more real than anything he owned. Several miles away, the storm pounded the small frontier town. Inside the saloon, 3 men burst through the doors. Snow covered their coats. The bartender looked up. "What happened to you boys?" One of the men slammed a muddy saddlebag onto the bar. "Robbed the wrong man tonight." The bartender frowned. "Who?" The bandit removed his mask. "Daniel Carter." The entire saloon went silent. Everyone in the territory knew that name. Daniel Carter wasn't just rich. He was powerful. His ranch employed half the county. The bartender's face turned pale. "You idiots," he whispered. The bandit scowled. "He's just a rancher." "No," the bartender said. "He's the most dangerous rancher alive." The bandit laughed. "Well, he ain't so dangerous now." But another man spoke. From the corner, a tall figure stepped forward. Slowly. "You sure about that?" The bandits turned. The man wore a long black coat and a sheriff's badge. "Sheriff Thomas Hale." "And why is that?" the bandit asked. The sheriff's eyes were cold. "Because Daniel Carter doesn't run." Silence filled the saloon. "If he escaped," the sheriff continued, "he's coming back." The bandits suddenly didn't look so confident. The storm was finally beginning to calm. Snow drifted softly outside. Mary added another log to the fire. Daniel had finally fallen asleep near the hearth. Lucy slept peacefully again. Mary sat quietly, watching the flames. Something about the stranger troubled her. Not fear, just curiosity. Who was he really? Why were his clothes expensive, yet worn? Why did he carry himself like a leader? Why did his eyes constantly scan the windows like he expected danger? Mary sighed and blew out the lantern. Morning would bring answers, but what she didn't know was that somewhere out in the darkness, 3 riders had just spotted the faint smoke rising from her chimney, and they were heading straight for the cabin. The same bandits who believed they had robbed Daniel Carter. And when they arrived, Mary Whitaker would unknowingly stand between them and the man they were trying to kill. Morning came slowly to the frozen plains. The storm had passed, but the world outside Mary Whitaker's cabin was buried beneath thick white snow. The sun struggled to break through grey clouds, casting a pale glow across the endless fields. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned low during the night. Mary woke first. She stretched quietly, careful not to wake Lucy, who was still curled beneath her patchwork blanket. For a moment, Mary simply sat there, listening. The wind had finally stopped. The silence felt almost strange after the violent storm. Then she remembered. The stranger. Mary turned toward the hearth. Daniel was still asleep on the floor beside the fire, wrapped in the old blanket she had given him. His hat rested beside him, and the early light from the window illuminated his face. Without the tension from the night before, he looked different, younger, calmer. But Mary also noticed something else, even while sleeping. His hand rested close to the revolver holstered at his belt. That wasn't something ordinary travelers did. Lucy suddenly stirred behind her. "Mama?" the little girl murmured. Mary smiled softly. "Morning, sweetheart." Lucy rubbed her eyes and immediately spotted Daniel. "Oh," she whispered excitedly. "The cowboy is still here." Mary laughed quietly. "Yes, he is." Lucy slid out from under the blanket and tiptoed closer to Daniel, studying him with the open curiosity only children have. "Does he live here now?" she whispered. Mary shook her head. "No, honey. He'll be leaving soon." Lucy looked disappointed. "But he seems nice." Mary smiled faintly. "Yes, he does." At that moment, Daniel's eyes opened. He had clearly heard every word. He sat up slowly, wincing slightly as his injured arm reminded him it was still there. "Morning," he said. Lucy grinned. "Morning, cowboy." Daniel chuckled. "Well, good morning to you too, Miss Lucy." Mary handed him a cup of warm water. It's not coffee, she apologized. We ran out last week. Daniel accepted it gratefully. Warm is good enough. Lucy sat beside him cross-legged. Are you going to ride horses today? She asked eagerly. Daniel smiled. Maybe. Lucy leaned closer. My daddy used to let me ride with him. Mary's expression softened at the memory. Daniel looked at Lucy carefully. You must be very brave. Then Lucy nodded proudly. I'm not scared of anything. Mary laughed. You were scared of the chicken yesterday. Lucy crossed her arms. That chicken is mean. Daniel laughed with them for a brief moment. The small cabin felt warm and peaceful. But that peaceful moment didn't last long. Daniel suddenly grew quiet. His eyes shifted toward the window. Mary noticed immediately. What is it? She asked. Daniel stood slowly. Stay here. He moved toward the door and opened it slightly. The cold air rushed inside. Daniel stepped onto the porch and scanned the snowy field at first. Everything looked calm. Then he saw it. 3 distant figures riding across the plains, coming straight toward the cabin. Daniel's expression hardened. Instantly, he closed the door and turned back to Mary. We have a problem. Mary frowned. What kind of problem? Daniel walked to the window again. Riders. Mary shrugged slightly. That's not unusual. Daniel shook his head. They're not travelers. Mary felt a sudden chill. How do you know? Daniel met her eyes. Because they're looking for me. The room went silent. Lucy looked confused. Why would someone look for you? Mary stepped closer. Daniel, who are you? Before he could answer, Lucy gasped. Mama. Horses. Mary rushed to the window. 3 riders were now clearly visible through the snow. They were approaching fast. Mary's heart began pounding. Daniel moved calmly toward the fireplace and checked his revolver. You should take Lucy into the back corner, he said quietly. Mary stared at him. What's happening? Daniel hesitated. Then he spoke the truth for the first time. They're the men who tried to kill me yesterday. Mary's eyes widened. Lucy clutched her mother's arm. Kill you? Daniel nodded. They think I have something they want. Mary's voice trembled slightly. Money? Daniel gave a small smile. Something like that. The sound of horses grew louder outside. The riders stopped. Just beyond the cabin, boots hit the snow, then knock. But this knock wasn't desperate like Daniel's. Had been taught it was hard. Demanding. Mary felt fear creep into her chest. Daniel looked at her calmly. You don't have to open it. Mary looked at Lucy, then back at the door. If those men believed Daniel was inside, they wouldn't leave easily. Another knock, this time louder. Open up, a rough voice shouted. Mary took a deep breath, then she did something Daniel didn't expect. She walked toward the door. Mary, he warned quietly, but she shook her head. I can't let them break it down. Daniel stepped aside but kept his hand near his gun. Mary opened the door. Slowly, 3 rough-looking men stood outside, snow clinging to their coats. One of them stepped forward, tall, scar across his cheek, mean eyes. Morning. Ma'am, he said coldly. Mary forced herself to stay calm. Can I help you? The man looked past her shoulder into the cabin. We're looking for someone. Mary crossed her arms. This is private property. The man smirked. Name's Cole. He stepped closer. And the man we're looking for rode this way last night. Mary kept her voice steady. I haven't seen anyone. Cole leaned even closer. You sure about that? Mary didn't blink. Positive. For a moment, the two stared at each other. Then Cole suddenly shoved the door open and stepped inside. His men followed. Mary's heart pounded. Lucy hid behind her. Cole scanned the cabin. His eyes landed on Daniel standing calmly beside the fireplace. The bandit grinned. Well, Daniel didn't move. Took you boys long enough. Cole laughed. Didn't expect you to hide in a poor widow's cabin. Mary froze. Widow. They knew. Cole turned toward her. Ma'am, you just gave shelter to the richest cowboy in the territory. Mary blinked. What? Cole gestured toward Daniel. That right there. He smiled cruelly. Is Daniel Carter? Mary looked back at Daniel. Her mind struggled to process the name. Daniel Carter. Even she had heard that name before. Everyone had. The man who owned half the land in the county. The man whose ranch stretched farther than most towns. The millionaire. Cattle king. And he had been sleeping on her floor, eating her last piece of bread. Lucy peeked out from behind Mary. Mama, the cowboy is rich. Cole laughed loudly. Rich enough to buy this entire county. Mary stared at Daniel. Is it true? Daniel sighed. Yes. Mary's emotions swirled. Shock, confusion, and something else. Betrayal. You lied to me, she said quietly. Daniel shook his head. I never said I was poor. Cole clapped. Slowly. Well, this is touching. But we're here for the money. Daniel's expression hardened. You already took it. Cole smiled darkly. And now we're taking the rest. He raised his gun. Lucy screamed. Mary stepped in front of her daughter instantly, and Daniel Carter finally reached for his revolver, because the next few seconds were about to decide everything. The cabin exploded into chaos. The moment Cole raised his gun, Daniel Carter moved like lightning. Bang! His revolver fired first. The bullet shattered the lantern hanging above the doorway, plunging half the room into shadow. Lucy screamed. Mary pulled her daughter behind the wooden table as gunfire erupted. Bang! Bang! 2 shots blasted through the cabin walls, splintering the wood beside the fireplace. Cole ducked behind a chair, cursing loudly. Kill him, he shouted to his men. Daniel had already rolled behind the heavy oak table, using it as cover. His injured arm burned with pain, but his aim stayed steady. Another bandit stepped forward. Bang! Daniel fired. The man's gun flew from his hand as the bullet struck the wall beside him. He yelped and stumbled backward, crashing into the door, the small cabin filled with smoke, the sharp smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. Mary held Lucy tightly, shielding her from the flying splinters. Stay down, Mary whispered. Lucy buried her face in her mother's coat. Cole growled from across the room. You can't win this, Carter. Daniel's voice was calm. I already did. Cole peeked around the chair and fired again. Bang! The bullet smashed a hole through the wooden cabinet behind Daniel. Daniel leaned out slightly. Bang! His shot shattered the rifle in Cole's hand. The weapon clattered to the floor. Cole cursed loudly. His last remaining partner panicked and rushed for the door. But before he could escape, bang! The sheriff's rifle fired from outside. The bandit dropped instantly into the snow. Everyone inside the cabin froze. Boots crunched on the frozen ground outside. Then the door burst open. Sheriff Thomas Hale stepped inside, rifle raised. Behind him stood 2 deputies. Drop whatever guns you've got left. The sheriff barked. Cole slowly lifted his hands, rage burning in his eyes. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered. Daniel stood up slowly, lowering his revolver. Took you long enough, Tom. The sheriff sighed. You always did like trouble. Daniel. The deputies quickly tied Cole's hands and dragged him outside. Silence filled the cabin again. The smoke slowly cleared. Mary finally stood, still holding Lucy protectively. Her hands trembled slightly. The sheriff looked around at the bullet holes in the walls. Looks like I missed the exciting part. Daniel shrugged. Just another morning. Lucy peeked out and stared at the sheriff. Are the bad men gone? The sheriff smiled kindly. They sure are, little lady. Lucy finally relaxed. Mary exhaled slowly, the tension leaving her shoulders. The sheriff walked over to Daniel. You all right? Daniel nodded. Thanks to Mary. The sheriff looked at her with respect. Ma'am, you showed more courage than most men. No, Mary shook her head. I was just protecting my daughter. Daniel watched her quietly. Then the sheriff turned serious. Again, We caught the third man about a mile back. He had your saddlebag. Daniel nodded. Good. The sheriff handed him the muddy bag filled with money, payrolls, all there. Daniel took it and glanced at Mary. She suddenly felt embarrassed. Don't worry, she said quickly. I never touched it. Daniel smiled gently. I know. The sheriff tipped his hat. Well, I'll take these idiots to town. He looked back at Daniel. Try not to start another war before lunch. Daniel chuckled. No promises. The sheriff and deputies dragged the captured bandit away. Soon their horses disappeared across the snowy plains. Silence returned to the cabin. Mary slowly sat down at the table. Her home looked like a battlefield. Bullet holes in the walls, broken furniture, shattered lantern glass. Lucy tugged at her sleeve. Mama, are we safe now? Mary nodded softly. Yes. Daniel stood quietly for a moment, looking around. Then he did something unexpected. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He placed it gently on the table in front of Mary. She looked at it cautiously. What is that? Daniel spoke calmly. A chance. Mary unfolded the paper. Her eyes widened. It was a land deed. Nearly 50 acres of fertile land near the river. She stared at him in shock. I don't understand. Daniel leaned against the table. You said yesterday that kindness is all a person has sometimes. Mary remembered her words. Daniel continued. Last night you gave your last food to a stranger. He looked around the small cabin. You risked your life protecting someone you barely knew. Mary shook her head slowly. I just did what anyone would do. Daniel smiled slightly. No, he pointed toward the window where endless snow-covered land stretched to the horizon. Most people out here would have shut the door. Mary looked down at the paper again. You can't just give this to me. Yes, I can. Lucy leaned closer to look. Mama, is that land? Mary nodded slowly. Daniel continued speaking. My ranch needs good people. He gestured toward the deed. That land sits right beside one of my pastures. Mary looked confused. Why give it to me? Daniel's voice softened. Because I want Lucy to grow up somewhere warm. Lucy's eyes lit up. With horses? Daniel smiled. As many horses as you want. Mary felt tears building in her eyes. For 2 years, she had struggled just to survive. And now, this man was offering a future she had never dreamed possible. You don't even know me, she whispered. Daniel met her eyes. I know enough. He picked up his hat. And I know people like you don't come around often. Lucy suddenly hugged his leg. Thank you, Cowboy. Daniel laughed and patted her head. You're welcome. Miss Lucy. Mary stood slowly. Her voice trembled. You saved our lives too. Daniel shrugged. Maybe we saved each other. He walked toward the door and opened it. Bright sunlight now covered the snowy plains. The storm had completely passed. Daniel stepped outside. Then he paused and looked back one last time. Pack your things, he said. Mary blinked. For what? Daniel grinned. For your new life. Lucy jumped excitedly. We're getting horses. Mary laughed through her tears. For the first time in years, hope had returned. Daniel Carter mounted his horse and began riding toward the distant horizon. Behind him, a poor widow and her daughter were no longer alone, and the night Mary gave shelter to a stranger had quietly changed their lives forever.